IVM.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Megha Pardhi. I'm a research analyst at the Takshashila Institution, Bangalore. In today's episode, we are exploring various aspects of Quad and Indo-Pacific. After the Quad was relaunched in 2017, Quad has been a popular topic of discourse regarding Indo-Pacific in 2021, after the first virtual meeting of leaders in Quad countries, that is India, United States, Australia, and Japan. The grouping regained traction. Later, when the detailed agenda of Quad cooperation was released, the first ever in-person meeting of Quad leaders in September, the details came out and discussion followed. So for presenting Quad as a counter to China, to the official narrative of cooperation security in the Pacific, motives of Quad has been widely debated and discussed. So to discuss this topic further and to discuss other different aspects of Quad and its future in Indo-Pacific, today we have with us Dr. Brendan Cannon, joined Khalifa University in 2016. He has earned PhD in political science with an emphasis on international relations at the University of Utah. His research interests include contextualizing domestic, regional, and international relations in Eastern Africa, regional security in the Gulf and Western India, the political economy of ports, bases, and airports, as well as the Indo-Pacific strategy of India, Japan, US, and Australia, as well as China's BRI, and how they relate and are operationalized in Eastern Africa. He's also author of multiple articles, books on Indo-Pacific. Welcome, Brendan.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, first of all, congratulations on publication of your recent paper. Can you briefly tell us about your paper? And also, in your paper, you have equated the Quad with a highly informal IGO. Can you please elaborate more on that for our listeners?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Megha. It's a pleasure to be here again. It's nice to be talking to somebody at your institute from here in Abu Dhabi, so we're not too far away. And thanks for the question on my new article. So this article is called Locating the Quad, Informality, Institutional Flexibility, and Future Alignment in the Indo-Pacific. Now, this was written by my colleague and I. My colleague, Dr. Ash Rossiter, also works here at Khalifa University. We published it in the International Politics Journal. And the point of all of this was to locate the structure and system of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or the Quad, formed by the Quartet of States, India, Australia, the United States, and Japan. Because there's a lot of questions about what the Quad does, what it doesn't do, what it's capable of, etc. And we found, in a nutshell, that part of the Quad's strength and part of its staying power is the fact that it is a highly informal organization as opposed to a formal organization. Now, there's a lot of literature in international relations on what's called IGOs, or informal governmental organizations. And there's been an impetus to move from a more formal setting where you would have institutions like the United Nations with an actual centralized hierarchy, high political visibility, et cetera, to more informality, where you wouldn't have, say, a headquarters anywhere. You would have a low to medium visibility. Your legalized obligations are not there. And there's a reason why a lot of states prefer the ambiguity that comes from informal organization. They prefer this for reasons of rational functionality. States can coordinate in meaningful ways without written provisions. So states might see useful functionalities in informality when banding together to confront a common long-term security threat, for example. And there's a couple of things that we can point to with informal organizations. First, Informality means members can strategically align without having to sacrifice any autonomy to a supranational entity. And second, with decentralized structures, informal intergovernmental organizations do not demand discipline or a strict hierarchy. So this allows for what we term trust-based relations among members who might otherwise be resistant to rule-taking from stronger parties with whom they may have conflicting issues. So in other words, these informals provide flexibility that allow members to coordinate with one another without really any concomitant obligations on their part. And I think that we've hit on something here about the Quad that really speaks to where each of the quartet members are. India, for obvious reasons, doesn't want to take rules from other states. Neither does Japan. Certainly Washington doesn't either. And so it works for them because they can coordinate on, say, a long-term interest or security threat, in this case, China, without any of those concomitant obligations. And so that's what our article is really about is, well, here's where we're going to locate the Quad in the IR literature, and this is why. And then how does this actually play out? How does the Quad function? Is this a weakness or a strength? And we had some judgments on that. And I'll be happy to talk with you more about that as we move through this recording.
That's quite interesting. So, of course, you have just outlined advantages of and why informal grouping is important and maybe more suitable. So can I say that the flexibility that such kind of informal grouping allows is one of the key reasons why Quad is still informal?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And so this is a two-way street, right? So informality allows states like India and Japan they both have difficult relations with China, but for different reasons, right? And different geographies, very, very interestingly. And this is the geopolitical side of things here, where Australia, the US, Japan, and India face unique geopolitical challenges with China that are all different from one another. They also are tied to China economically in ways that everybody can see and are very, very clear. And so there's this ability for Prime Minister Modi to stand on the steps of the White House with the Prime Minister of Japan, the President of the United States, and the Prime Minister of Australia, and have a nice photo op and issue a very vague joint leaders statement now that doesn't mention China at all. And yet it's become this very powerful signal. It plays well in all four capitals of the Quad states, in Tokyo and Delhi, etc. It sends a signal to Beijing, where it doesn't play very well, where it acts as something of a wake-up call. All right. And so it plays this very, very vital signaling role, not only for China, but for the four Quad states. As we term it, the band is back together again. They've already met, the leaders have already met in early March of this year. They're going to meet again in late May. So if anything, the tempo of the Quad and the impetus for it has accelerated during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the problem is that signaling can result in blowback. And China has said on a couple of different occasions that, we don't agree that our world should be full of exclusive cliques, of limited groups. And this is something about informals that actually dovetails with previous formal organizations or more old school style diplomacy. If you think back to the 1940s and 50s and 60s, where you had a bunch of career diplomats who all knew each other for decades, getting together in the same room and kind of hammering out deals together. So it was almost like a club, an exclusive club. Well, one of the strengths or weaknesses, depending on the perspective of the Quad, is that it is quite club-like. After all, there's only 4 members, and you're either in or you're out, right? And so regardless of these spin-offs, such as the Quad Plus or the Quad of India, the UAE, Israel, and the US, really at the end of the day, the Quad is the 4 major powers we're talking about here. And so that is something, an element that is interesting about it. and also one that really does seem to bother China. So far from being the sea foam that Foreign Minister Wang Yi stated it was back in 2018, saying that this Indo-Pacific, this Quad will disappear like sea foam. If anything, it has really gained traction. And obviously this concerns the Chinese for a variety of reasons, possibly because of the ambiguity of the Quad. Again, there's something known as strategic ambiguity in foreign policies and in defense stances and in deterrence theory that is either positive or negative. And so this is, again, something that needs to be explored because the Quad has strengths on one level, as I keep saying, via its informality, but some potential very, very big weaknesses because of that as well.
Interesting. So one of the discourse around Quad is also on centrality of democracies coming together. So how do you think that, or what is the likely impact of this discourse on centrality of democracy on the Quad convergence in Indo-Pacific? Is it possible to shift this debate from centered around values to the one which is centered on interest or coalitions in the Indo-Pacific?
It's a good question. If you'd asked me this maybe 2 years ago, I would have answered differently than I'm going to answer now. I saw that this normativity and this emphasis on, not so much on democracy, but on rules-based was in some respects taking away from what I viewed should be really the strategic nature in confronting threats that the Quad, that's the role I thought the Quad should play. But after writing this article and then also working with a Japanese co-editor on our new book, Indo-Pacific Strategies, which is being published by Routledge, I've come to the conclusion that this normativity actually plays quite an important role. Look, I don't think that the Quad necessarily emphasizes democracy. It just happens to be that there's 4 democracies in the Quad, and this is a commonality that works within the group. It's one of the things that maybe assists in a level of cohesiveness amongst group members, and there's a common culture of democracy, if you will. But and maybe this is why spin-offs like the Quad Plus and others that don't include democratic members with similar governmental cultures don't seem to really get off the ground, although it's early going yet. But nonetheless, this normativity and this rules-based aspect, which is very much a part of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's original free and open Indo-Pacific concept, came out of his democratic security diamond concept. I think that this is also part of the bounded nature of the Indo-Pacific concept itself. It is not all directional like China's Belt and Road Initiative. Rather, there are limits to it. And this butts up against what is termed India's inclusivity and its emphasis on a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. And my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Jagannath Panda, who's written a chapter for our book, Indo-Pacific Strategies, on India's foreign policy, was very, very clear about this, that India sees the way forward as somewhat of a middle path, one that is highly inclusive. I don't know that the other Quad members agree with that. And there are numerous reasons for this that we could talk about for 24 hours or more. But in the end, allowing in members who do not necessarily respect, say, the rule of law, not so much democracy, but rule of law, that is really perhaps opening up the Quad and the Indo-Pacific concept in general to some kind of capture from within. And so my co-editor and I, Kei Hakata, in our introductory chapter, really address that and talk about, look, there are limits to the Quad. And there's not only geographical limits to it right now, but there's also some conceptual limits as well that probably are pretty central to it at the end of the day. And like I said, my answer to your questions changed over the past 2 years significantly.
Yeah, this is very interesting. So on this note, we'll take a little short break.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On The Habit Coach, Dr. Madan Kataria tells Ashton how laughter yoga came to be. On Pesa Vesa Anupamas Mukesh Kalra, founder and CEO at ET Money, about their new intelligent investment service, ET Money Genius. On Smarter with Sid, Siddharth explores the relationship between Twitter, free speech, and Elon Musk. On The Habit Coach, Ashton shares tips on how to not abandon a new habit midway. And on Say No to Drama, Chetna guides us through a process to better identify our intuition. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're following this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Word of mouth is one of our biggest, most helpful things you could do for us. We'd really appreciate that. And also, don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening on. And you can also check us out on YouTube. Go check out ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. You get a list of all of our YouTube channels there. We're also doing a small listener survey to better understand how you respond to our shows and the advertising on the network. We would really appreciate it if you could spare a few minutes to fill it out. It's at ivmpodcast.com/survey. This really helps us build better shows for you. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors for this week, SBI Life Insurance, India Water Portal, and Jupiter, a digital banking app.
Welcome back to All Things Policy. Today, I'm discussing Indo-Pacific, future of Quad with Dr. Brendan Cannon. So just before the break, we talked about his paper and the nature of Quad as an informal grouping, where this paper also hypothesizes that Quad highlights Quad as a highly informal intergovernmental organization. We also discussed the centrality of democracy as a discourse in Quad grouping. So moving on from that, now there has been a lot of discussion about India's position in Quad. Also, US, Japan, and Australia already have, a deeper relationship with each other on different issues. For example, but India's relationship with each member of the Quad is still evolving. For example, both Australia and Japan are part of joint artificial intelligence center that is on Super JICE. They're also part of different agreements, which, for example, International Test and Evaluation Agreement, which can be crucial to strengthening partnerships on artificial intelligence, which is also a very, emerging technology and very important part of Quad. But India is still not part of these agreements and MOUs. And India still has a long way to go to reach the level of cooperation which already exists among the other members of Quad. So my question is, do you think that partnerships among Quad have potential to reach that level? Or is that level of partnership even necessary for Quad to function effectively?
Well, that's a tough question. It's a very good one. Look, the Quad can function just fine without that level. And you can see that already. It's not as if Australia, Japan, and the US are linked up on the same levels either. We see the development of AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US, kind of the bombshell that blew up in September, October last year that really took everybody by surprise to include Quad members. And I've argued in another analysis published recently on AUKUS that this is all about technology and it's all about trust. And so these highly, highly sensitive technologies go into nuclear submarines, for example. The reason those are being shared amongst the AUKUS members is you've got over 75 years, if not longer, of not only trust-based intelligence sharing relationships, but, and this is a minefield in today's day and age, but the common cultural sentiments and ways of doing things, I don't think can be discounted here. And so I think that those two things, which are mutually constitutive, have led to AUKUS. That doesn't mean that the Quad has somehow fallen by the wayside. I know there was some initial concern in both Tokyo and Delhi about this, but I think most Indians and Japanese have understood that the two are playing somewhat different roles, but they actually support one another. I mean, if the end of all this Indo-Pacific is dealing with a rising reprobate, in some respects, China, then you want to have both a Quad and AUKUS. And not everybody needs to be part of AUKUS. Not everybody needs to be part of Quad. And I think we saw even maybe there was too much activity on one level in the Indo-Pacific with fellow democracies, to include France, that was getting a bit worrisome to certain members of the Quad as far as we've got too many things going on here. And maybe AUKUS was in part a reaction to the French efforts to make its own Indo-Pacific, which would have just complicated things, perhaps. So, look, the recent issue over Ukraine has shown once again that the Quad is all about the Indo-Pacific. It's not about all of Eurasia. This is something, again, not to keep talking about this book that I've recently co-edited, but we address the issue of Eurasia. Obviously, India, China, and Russia are all Eurasian powers and members or lie in the Eurasian continent. And the Eurasian continent is not addressed in the Indo-Pacific concept and strategies yet. If anything, it is a sideshow, but one that we, co-editor and I, believe should be addressed effectively because it's a grave oversight. But it is not central to the workings of the Quad, nor is it necessarily central to Indo-Pacific, which is largely a maritime conception, and it is bounded by geography, even though the four members don't agree where the Indo-Pacific begins strategically and where it ends. You know, the U.S. famously says it's from Hollywood to Bollywood, whereas I believe Delhi thinks that it's from the east coast of Africa all the way to the west coast of the United States and South America, as do the Japanese. So look, it's part of the great thing about the Indo-Pacific itself and the Quad is that we wouldn't expect the imposition of some kind of authoritarian vision on all of this. This is a group of democracies. It is a lively round table, and therefore it's going to be a bit messy. And that's just the way it is. Neither India nor the United States or the others operate in a way that an authoritarian China with a president at the top operates.
Yeah, so that is quite interesting explanation. And so with the bit where you mentioned that there are different conceptions of Indo-Pacific also reminded me of part of the panel which you were also part of at Harvard, where the exact same topic was discussed, how notion of Indo-Pacific is literally quite different and how each country defines Indo-Pacific differently. And as a student of IR, even though I knew that, but, to see that in pictures was, quite interesting to the extent that how much it differed. There is this just, something I remembered when you talked about different norms. Yeah. So, and also you mentioned, interestingly, you mentioned Ukraine and Russia war. So there has been a lot of criticism over India's position in this war, and especially, outright refusal to condemn Russia. While the Quad partners have shown some understanding of India's position, but do you think that, that India's repeated abstentions in UN will affect the dynamics in Quad?
No, I don't. Look, I think in some respects, India itself is uncomfortable with the position it's taken, but there are reasons why it's done it, and which is why it's been somewhat defensive about the reasons it's doing it. But I don't think it's going to affect the dynamics of the Quad, and here's why. There is no Indo-Pacific without India. Mm-hmm. So India actually holds some very, very good cards in all of this. Does it make the other quartet members question the motivations of India? Yes, but no more so than the Indians question the motivations of the others when it comes to Doklam and where were you supporting us, etc. So, this is part of the ambiguity that comes with this relationship. In a more perfect world, the Quad wouldn't exist anyway. And that's one of the takeaways of our research paper, this paper on the Quad that I wrote with Dr. Ash Rossiter, is we don't preclude the Quad turning into a more formal alliance, but it's all predicated on the actions of China. And so at the end of the day, and as Foreign Minister Jaishankar said just the other day at the Raisina Dialogue, as he reminded the Europeans about, you're talking about a seminal moment in Europe. We've been dealing with this for 10 years in Asia. China actually is driving the train here as far as how close the Quad gets. And so we can expect this not to be a straight line. We can expect it to be more perhaps of something like the Quad is more cohesive in a certain time period and becomes less relevant at another time period. Look, even with formal alliances like NATO, you see this. It seemed irrelevant for almost 30 years. All of a sudden, it seems extremely relevant. So that's I think, our takeaway here. Now, if the Quad does solidify, and it does mature and becomes perhaps even more formal than it already is, this will certainly be viewed as hostile by Beijing. And that will heighten tensions in the region. And you've got kind of this push-pull effect that is almost mutually constitutive, which, depending on your viewpoint, is possibly not the most positive outcome that we would desire.
Yeah, so coming back to Quad now, do you think that Quad will be more formal in future? I mean, you did mention that there's a possibility, right? Do you see this, informal structure continuing?
Well, I see it continuing for the time being. The world's eyes are on Ukraine and Russia right now, even though they actually prefer, I would say that Delhi made it very clear that they would prefer that our eyes remain on the Indo-Pacific, where they would say the problem is. Washington certainly feels the same way. So Washington, Delhi, Tokyo, and Canberra are again on the same page here, where they're viewing Ukraine as somewhat of a sideshow, an unfortunate sideshow. And that sentiment, by the way, is shared by the Chinese, who also feel that this is an unfortunate occurrence. And we're quite, at least in my reading, we're quite flustered by Russia's actions, thinking that Russia didn't have to actually take the steps it's taken. So the future of the Quad, as I already alluded to it a bit earlier, but the historical record actually shows us balancing coalitions do not take full shape until aggressors make significant conquests, all right? And generally this involves territory of some sort. So again, we're back to the which comes first, the chicken or the egg. Well, in this case, we can actually definitively say it's the actions of China. We're not in a conundrum like the chicken and the egg. But so that's why I keep saying that China doesn't want to see the Quad become more cohesive. And yet at the same time, depending on the actions China takes, it can expect the Quad to become more cohesive or less so if tensions are relaxed.
So since China is kind of, central, I would say that China is a central concern. How do you conceptualize a stable regional security architecture without China, which is, of course, one of the most powerful actors, I would say, in Indo-Pacific?
Sorry, Meg, I didn't understand. Did you say without China?
I mean, can we conceptualize a regional security architecture excluding China, but not kind of, concentrated on China, probably? Is that possible?
Yeah, look, maybe I don't understand the question, but we already have a regional security architecture that's developing that is exclusive of China.
Okay.
After all, if one were to state baldly what are the resources of the Quad member states pointed at, well, it's no secret that they are pointed at China, and vice versa. Again, it's a two-way street. I think that everybody would hope that. I think part of the Indo-Pacific concept in general and the normativity of it is that China would somehow choose to partake, as it has in kind of the liberal economic side of things and more of the liberal political side of things. It doesn't mean it needs to become a democracy, but there's this concept of sea lanes of communication. And so island building in the South China Sea, claims on the Senkaku Islands in Japan. This is where the problem lies. It's the border claims that China has in India that are where the problem is. Other than that, Delhi and Beijing would probably get along pretty well for most of the time. So I hate to throw the ball every time into Beijing's court, but this is part of the issue. What we probably don't want to see, although this is more optimal than aggression, is something developing like the Cold War, where you have set blocks. Unfortunately, I'm seeing that the Ukraine crisis has played a role in states choosing sides, even though they don't realize they're doing so in some respects. This was something that was talked about 5 years ago, where states going to have to start choosing sides. States like the UAE, where I currently reside, or others, in this ongoing great power competition with China and the US. And the answer is kind of like, no, well, that's not going to happen for a long time. It seems to be solidifying, unfortunately. And again, this is very different from the Cold War, where the Warsaw Soviet bloc was economically walled off from the rest of the world. But I see that is possibly something that is occurring at this point. Again, maybe this Russia-Ukraine thing, there's a silver lining in it where China and India and the United States and others realize that actually they have more in common with one another than what is uncommon. But I'm not going to make any judgments on that occurring anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's probably too early to talk about or, make a judgment on Ukraine-Russia issue as of now. But yeah, there are a few instances where India's and China's concerns do probably overlap on this issue. So I think that's it for today. And this has been such an enlightening discussion. I mean, I have had a lot of discussions on Quad. I have myself read a lot about Quad, but after reading your paper and after this discussion, probably I have this sense of clarity. Okay, this is this and this is that. So thank you so much again for joining me today. Yeah, I hope our listeners also enjoy this conversation as much as I did.
Well, thank you very much, Megha. And I think I can thank you for the excellent questions you asked. I mean, I hope I didn't confuse anybody too much with my back and forth answers, but it's been a real pleasure to be with you today and to participate in this podcast and with your institution.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Do you find yourself in a room full of people talking about investments and insurances and feel left out? Do you also want to understand how to spend your money wisely? Then you have come to the right place. Welcome to SBI Life Presents A Sip of Finance, a women-exclusive podcast where we break down difficult financial topics into simple and straightforward episodes with your host, Priyanka Acharya, a finance expert who's been in the industry for 14 plus years. And not just in English, but in 7 more languages. So tune in every Tuesday for fresh episodes on the IVM Podcast Network and all major podcast streaming platforms.
Namaste, this is Cyrus Brocha. I am part of the government cancel culture program to remove rubbish off all the different streams available. So what we have is all the collected rubbish we put together on our show. It's called Cyrus Says. It's on IVM Podcast. You have to watch it and listen to it. It's on our app. It's on our website. It's on the YouTube channel. It's on Facebook. There are many different ways. Don't bother me and ask me how. You have to find out. We talk to different personalities. Many of them are known. Some are just people we meet downstairs and invite them up for chai. But the point is, it's fun and it's very therapeutic. So please join in and listen to Cyrus Says.